says that he quotes Bart Ehrman, who says that contemporary accounts are the best for historiography. He then goes on to say um, that these accounts, the accounts of the Mormon of Joseph Smith with the golden plates, is very good history. We get primary source material of these eyewitness accounts, but yet we know it's all bogus. But yet this is early accounts and consistent witnesses, and it's better than the Gospels, and yet we know Joseph Smith's telling us a lie. Okay. Then he goes into contradictions in the Gospel accounts, such as the time of the Passover, the day of the Passover, the time of the death of Christ, who carried the cross, and etc. Then the final argument is that the resurrection didn't happen because Paul didn't teach a resurrection, he taught a spiritual resurrection. So that's basically Dan's argument. I'm just going to rebut it for the next 15 minutes, okay? First of all, he says we have to prove these four things about Jesus. Jesus was actually a human being, Jesus was died, placed in the tomb, Jesus died prior to being placed in the tomb, and Jesus was placed in the tomb, and four, Jesus was physically restored. The first 3 points are already proved by history. If you knew the history of this topic, he'd know that the work by E.P. Sanders, who is the leader in this field, would not agree with the Bible, would not agree with certain things about the Gospels, but has said that the basic facts of Jesus, that he was a human being in history, in the first century Jew, that he died, that he was placed in the tomb of Arimathea. He accepts that. Dominic Crossan, who was a skeptic scholar, says that Jesus dying on a cross is the most well-attested historical fact in history. We know this from Paul's early source material, 1 Corinthians 15, which says, "Now I would remind you, brothers, of the Gospels I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the Lord I preached to you, unless you believe in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for out of sin, in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then all the apostles. Last of all, as an untimely born, he appeared to me, for I am the least of the apostles." Now this text, written probably in the 50s, 58, round in early mid-50s AD, scholars will tell you is rich in tradition and goes back to an earlier tradition of AD 33, 34. Okay, so we know from that passage alone that we have early historical source material of the death and the burial of Jesus Christ. Okay. Also we have the early church fathers, such as Clement, is another example of good historical source material, which is solid historical source material, and also extra source material that's not to the Bible, such as Josephus. Most scholars would agree that it has been tampered with, but his testimonium does tell us a kernel about Jesus' life. And then thirdly, Tacitus. A whole lot of Roman scholars will tell you that there's no dispute about that passage, about how it talks about Jesus. Alright, we could say that, well, where did Tacitus get his source material for that? Well, we could say that about a lot of historians. The fact of the matter is, Tacitus would not have written that unless he had some good source material to back it up, okay? Because that's how good a historian he was. So the basic facts are generally established, and also the basic fact that even Bart Ehrman will tell you that on the fourth point of Dan, Bart Ehrman, Dominic Crossan, E.P. Sanders, Gomez, we could go on and on, N.T. Wright, these are massive scholars, will tell you that the early church had visions of Jesus in the early first century. So the issue there is, what are those visions? Was it real? Was it a real resurrection, or was it an hallucination? The issue with psychological models is they don't fit the experience of the early church, because there were so many different sightings of Jesus at different periods, different places, in different contexts, to people, groups of people, individual, that no psychological model can answer all these various visions. So you can't answer the resurrection from a naturalist perspective. The issue with the resurrection is there are certain facts that we know. Number one, that women were the main sightseers of the resurrection. Now, why did the early church build its preaching on the resurrection on women, when women were not respected in the court of law? Their testimony was not respected. So why go around saying Jesus rose from the dead based on women's accounts? The naturalist explanation of the resurrection can't account for that. Secondly, as Gomez has said, he was a Jew, this guy's a Jew, he said the resurrection is a fact because of this reason. The early church people, the disciples, ran away at the time of Jesus' death. They gave up. And then suddenly, a few days later, they're appearing in Jerusalem preaching with boldness. And he said, because of this fact, and he's a Jew, he never became a Christian. He says, because of this fact, Jesus rose from the dead. Okay? You have to explain why the disciples gave up and then suddenly were preaching in Jerusalem. The only explanation that you can have is that Jesus literally rose from the dead. The third issue is the enemies of Jesus becoming Christians. How do you explain that? How do you explain Paul and James and others that were enemies of the Christian faith at his time became Christians? And fourth, how do you explain the birth of the early church? These people were Jewish people. What made them go from Orthodox Jews